brightly.
Thank you for joining us today for the Spirit of the Law, a best practices approach to environment of care standards. I just wanted to let you know that the phones are muted. We will be monitoring the chat area. We'll record today's session and we'll send you a link later this week. So the agenda for today will be looking at the rationale behind the Joint Commission standards related to environment of care, risk assessment, and environmental tour, best practices for assessing risk related to the environment of care, and how to approach and document environmental tours and environment of care committee decision making. I'm very proud to announce our speaker, Susan McLaughlin. Sue is a founding partner of MSL Healthcare Partners. She's on the board of directors for the American Society for Healthcare Engineering and represents ASHE as a chair of the NFPA 99 Technical Committee on Emergency Management and Security. She is a member of the ASHE Faculty for the Environment of Care Compliance Program and a certified healthcare facility manager. Prior to founding MSL, she was the Director of Safety and Compliance for ASHE and Associate Director, Standards Interpretation, Environment of Care Standards for the Joint Commission, where she served as team leader of the Standard Interpretation Group. Sue, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure, and thank you very much for having me. We're going to talk today about the spirit of the law, the best practices for environment of care standards. And I have to tell you up front that this is an excerpt of a program that was originally presented at the ASHE annual conference last July in Boston. So with that, we're going to get started. There are a variety of approaches that hospitals take to approaching survey. And I want to review some of them from the beginning so that we kind of have a baseline and we can kind of see where we are at in this continuum. You know, there's some folks that look at survey and they think, oh my, this is just something else that's added to what I already have to do. I'm so busy. Why can't I just do my regular job? There are others who say, why does this have to be so complicated? Or maybe, oh no, it's time for survey again. Then there are others who are ultimately concerned with patient safety and want to do everything possible to drive performance improvement and patient care, patient safety in their organization. And yet, here's one more. Hopefully, we don't have too many folks who are in this category, but there are those out there whose hospital really kind of takes more or less of this comply or die approach, and hopefully that's not where you are. So, a little bit of background to get started. The Joint Commission standards are and always have been standards for minimum compliance. This is what you have to do at a minimum to be held in compliance with the Joint Commission standards. So what we're going to do today is look a little bit about what the standards actually say, which I'm calling the letter of the law, or where you can take them in your organization to really comply with the spirit of the law, not just what it says on paper as a minimum, but where you can go beyond that. So in EC 020101 EP1, we have a requirement for risk assessment. And it's on your slide here. The hospital identifies safety and security risks associated with the environment of care that could affect patient, staff, and other people coming to the organization's facilities. And then there's a note along with that. And, you know, this is an abbreviated version of that note on your slide that says risks are identified from internal sources and from credible external sources. So it kind of puts a little bit of framework and sets some pretty wide boundaries on where you get the information for risk assessment. The rationale for the risk assessments is that everybody, all healthcare organizations, have safety and security risks. Sometimes I read, for example, safety management plans, and it tells me that the organization is going to eliminate risks. Well, I think that's a nice thought, but I really have never seen a place that was fully able to eliminate all risks. I think at best we can minimize risks, but everybody has them is the point. And so what the Joint Commission is asking us to do is to look for risks proactively, and along with that, to either prevent those incidents that you can or effectively respond to the incidents that you do have. So approaches to risk assessment, and again, these are kind of all over the map. Some hospitals do an annual review of risks by department, kind of using an approach similar to the hazard vulnerability analysis for emergency management. And that's certainly one way that you can do it. But looking at that as one of the possibilities, you have to ask yourself in your organization, is this a rote process that we do every year, or are we really looking for risks that we can evaluate and perhaps mitigate? Is it only done by the safety officer? And can your environment of care committee describe some of the risk assessments that you've performed and the outcome of those risk assessments? So to look at performance improvement in the whole risk assessment arena, you want to look, one, at how often you do this. On the previous slide, we talked an annual evaluation of the department risk, which is one thing, but are you looking at risks as they arise, as they are identified, as they are brought before the Environment of Care Committee? And who performs those risk assessments? More than just one person, for example, the safety officer, do you appoint a designated task force of interested parties? Or is it a function of the Environment of Care Committee itself to participate in those risk assessments? Either one of those, I think, demonstrates some performance improvement because basically, always two heads are better than one, and the more of the relevant people you get involved, the more input that you'll have. Managing them on an ongoing basis as they're identified, rather than waiting for an annual risk assessment process, is also going to be more effective in terms of managing those risks. Now, you want to look at where you get the information for your risk assessment sources. Do you have any kind of a safety hotline or a reporting system where anybody in the organization can come forward and say, hey, I'm not so sure about this. It doesn't look so safe to me. Can somebody take a look at it? That would be one benefit where you really are getting the whole organization involved and everybody's eyes is looking for the risks. Do you go through the incident reports or that are made during your organization or your occurrence reports and look for things that repeat and possibly represent risks in your organization? Are you looking at everything that you find on your environmental tours as a risk assessment process? And then finally, this is just really walking around your organization with your eyes open. What do you see when you walk around that might be a safety issue? If you do get your entire staff involved in the whole risk identification process, one of the things that you also want to consider is how do you give feedback to the staff members that actually reported it. So something that you could put together as a whole process to close the loop when staff do present a potential security risk. You have a variety of ways that you can document the whole risk assessment process. There's no right or wrong way, but one way to do it is in the Environment of Care Committee minutes, and that would represent a documented risk assessment. Whatever you do for risk assessment, the documentation is important. Like we said, a hazard vulnerability type form can be used for risk assessment, and it can be effective if it becomes more than just a rote annual process. And then the last thing that I would refer you to for documentation is there was an article published in Environment of Care News, which is published by the Joint Commission. This was actually in March of 2013. It's written by George Mills at Joint Commission, called 7 Easy Steps to Risk Assessment, which really puts some nice boundaries around your whole process and something you might want to take a look at. Now let's move to environmental tours. There are 3 standards which directly relate to environmental tours. First of all, they're all in EC 040101. EP 12 requires them semi-annually in patient care areas, EP 13 annually in non-patient care areas, and EP 14 using the tours to identify environmental deficiencies, hazards, and unsafe practices. Now, when you look at EP 12, it says also to evaluate the effectiveness of previously implemented activities intended to minimize or eliminate environment of care risk. So let's look at the rationale, and for that we go throughout EC 040101. It starts with talking about data monitoring, moves from there to reporting and investigating the incidents, and then going to the purposes of the Environment of Care tours, which we just talked about on the previous slide. So that's kind of the progression throughout the whole EC 040101 standard. And when you look at that, it kind of concludes with the environmental tours and then the annual evaluation. Approaches that you can take to the environmental tours. One is, obviously, you have to visit all patient care areas semi-annually and non-patient care areas annually. That would be a minimum level of compliance. What do you report back to the Environment of Care Committee based on those tours that you've conducted? For example, do you have a performance monitor that says all the tours are complete? Well, that performance monitor would be reporting something that you're required to do. It really doesn't tell you anything other than that you did what you were required to do. Do you struggle in your organization with getting completion documentation back from the department heads? Once you tell them that there are some issues in their department, do people promptly respond, or do you really have to go out there and push and push and push to get that information back based on the completion? All right, so then the next question I want to ask you is, what do you do with the data for your environmental tours? Do you file it, put it in your book, and be done with it? Do you report that all tours were completed summary to the Environment of Care Committee? Or do you use it to monitor your process? I will tell you that choices A and B would meet the requirements, But choice C uses that data, all those things that you're looking at when you're out doing your environmental tours, for performance improvement. So let's talk about performance improvement with the environmental tours. First of all, who's doing the tours? Is it one or two people? Is it randomly assigned? How are those folks trained? Or is it a multidisciplinary team of subject matter experts? Do you develop and stick to a schedule so that you surely cover all of those departments during the course of the year? And then finally, do you work off a standardized checklist? Working with a checklist is really the only way to assure that you've got a standardized process where you can get data that will be meaningful. So, in my opinion, looking at a lot of hospitals every year, probably the most underutilized source of data is the environmental tours. We are out there all the time looking at all of these departments, and we are not using the data well. So what you want to look at are what are the most frequent things you see? What departments do best? What departments demonstrate consistent opportunities for improvement? And if you have a standardized approach, you can compile that data. Which departments are frequently delinquent in their response, in getting back to you with the feedback? What's the average turnaround time for completion of this documentation? And what issues demonstrate the most improvement? These are all things that you can track and trend with a standardized process. So my recommendation is for a strong performance improvement is look at all this data. You're getting your performance monitors right here. You can identify opportunities for improvement. You can report this tracking and trending to the Environment of Care Committee. And in fact, you can consider reporting it at management meetings where all departments can get a chance to see what's going on in the organization as well. Furthermore, this is a great source of data to use in your annual evaluation. Now let's look at the Environment of Care Committee. 3 standards, the EC 040103 standards. The first one requires representation from clinical, administrative, and support services throughout your organization. The second EP says that you use data to make environment of care decisions. And the third one says that you make an annual performance improvement recommendation to leadership. So the rationale for this is that the Environment of Care Committee is supposed to be actively reviewing the data collected from all of the activities found in Standard EC 040101, and that the decisions of the Environment of Care Committee should be based on the analysis of data. You identify opportunities for improvement, and based on all that data and the discussions within the committee, you make an annual recommendation to leadership for performance improvement activities. So let's look at some approaches that various hospitals have with respect to their Environment of Care Committee. First of all is a department director or an administrative assistant acting as the administrative representative. That happens sometimes. Or maybe you have a vice president on the EOC committee, but that VP's attendance is rare or sporadic. Or you only have one nurse on the committee, which would meet the requirements, but that person represents infection prevention or employee health or nursing leadership rather than your frontline staff nursing. Or is overall attendance at your Environment of Care committee poor? The surveyors actually look at all of these things and may make comments to you based on the status of your committee. Another set of approaches that may be taken in your organization, that you're not reporting much data, if any, or that you're reporting data, but all that's recorded in the minutes is the reports are received and the reports are accepted without any evidence of discussion, either of the reports or of significant issues. Another common problem is that the issues that are referenced in the minutes are not followed through to completion. In other words, you put an issue in the minutes 1 month and discuss it a little bit, and John Doe is supposed to go out and collect some information and bring it back to the next committee meeting. The surveyors will then look at the next committee meeting to see if that information actually came back. And if it didn't, they might look for 1 or 2 meetings more, but if it never appears again, then you are leaving open issues on the table. You're not closing them out, and that's a problem too. When we do the Environment of Care interview at survey, can committee members speak to the data? Do they know what's been reported in, what's been discussed, what you're doing with that data? And can they easily and readily identify what you recommended to the leadership for your performance improvement opportunity last year? That's something that I find fairly frequently when I ask about it in mock interview sessions. I really kind of get the deer in the headlights with what performance improvement recommendation to leadership. So these are things that happen out there too. And then this next photo, I would ask you, does your committee look like this? Because if it does, that's a symptom. So let's look at some performance improvements that we may act upon or in the Environment of Care. First of all, the committee is intended to be a vital and important part of the organization. One of the things that you can do is set up and establish a committee charter, which will define the purpose of the committee, the expectations and the responsibilities of membership, and so on and so forth. When you do that, you would establish all of that with the committee itself to get the buy-in and have the members really engage in and understand those expectations. It's expected to be a working committee where everybody participates, and sometimes you get an assignment with something you have to do before the next meeting. But everybody participates. This is not intended to be a committee where you just sit and listen. How about documents? Do you distribute them in advance so that everybody can read them and digest them prior to the meeting so that you come prepared? Do you hand out the assignments, and are the assignments completed and documented in the minutes that the loop was closed and this information came back? Are you discussing real risks rather than just receiving reports? How are you identifying risks and how are you discussing them? And based on your discussion, are you issuing recommendations to departments that have the ability to respond to those recommendations. Do your minutes tell the story of what goes on in those meetings? And can your committee members tell the story? That will come out during your environment of care interview session, and you really want to make sure that your committee members can speak to those issues. So, at this point, I'm going to turn this over to Anna, who is going to talk about the CMMS and how that can help in all of these processes.
Thank you so much, Sue. Good to talk to everyone this afternoon. Sue's going to have some closing thoughts for us in just a couple of minutes, and we're also going to have a time to share your questions with her and hear some of her feedback. So I'm excited for that, and we'll get right to that. But I wanted to take a moment to pause and talk about, follow up from Sue's presentation so far about how your CMMS solution can help you in these efforts to go above and beyond in your approach to environment of care. And I really want to focus on three areas, and that's tracking the progress of improvements you're making based on those risk assessments that Sue's been discussing, monitoring specified aspects of the environment of care over time, things like fire safety management issues, utility systems management issues, and with that key piece that Sue just talked about, and that is keeping the Environment of Care Committee informed and prepared for those meetings so that they can be as productive as possible. So specifically, we're going to be talking about documentation and reports that you'd have using Facility Dude System, Maintenance Edge, but hopefully you'd be able to get this type of documentation from whatever maintenance tracking system you're currently using. So I'm going to go ahead and share out some reports in my system with you. So I'm doing that now. And we should be on a page that has a pie chart in the middle of that. Hopefully you have that. And the first thing that we need to talk about is tracking the work that you're doing based on those risk assessments that you've done. And the idea here is to use your CMMS solution to connect the work that you're doing or that you're going to do, being able to customize labels, put those on the work that you're doing so that you can pull that documentation, know what's been done, what hasn't been done, the time and the cost associated with that work. And so in your CMMS system, you should be able to create categories, for instance, like environment of care, or a specific project or plan that you have to make those improvements. So in terms of the reporting that is available to you as a result of that, you should be able to see what are, and I've got a specific plan here to go back and correct some issues that I've found with my fire doors. So in this example, I am able to see what work is ongoing, what am I working on currently, what are the next stages of the project or the other jobs that are associated with this correction plan. Target start dates for those, target completion dates, so that I'll be able to look at the average age of those work orders. In other words, that response time that Sue was talking about. How responsive are we? Yes, I'm sorry.
Anna, this is Sue. I have a blank screen.
Okay, excuse me. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that everybody has what they're supposed to have, and they don't for some reason. So I'm going to, thank you for bringing that up. Do you have a report now?
Yes, I do.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sue. I appreciate that. So now we're all looking at it. We'll go back and talk about this. You should have, as I said, a report that has sort of three items of work that I need to do to go back and do some work on my fire doors. So I'm able to see the projected start dates and completion dates for each of those jobs, the average age of those work orders so that I can then go back and look at my responsiveness. And then even in other ways look at the cost and the time involved. So this is a great way to be able, by creating those custom categories, to pull that work together that you are doing and track it and document that that's been completed and when. Now, if this is something that you can automate to have sent to the engineering team, to be sent to that environment of care committee, depending on what level of involvement folks have at certain times. And then also, if this is a formal plan for improvement, this can be sent periodically, as well as you can use your CMMS solution to set reminders for yourself, say several weeks before the end of your set completion date, or before the end of the grace period, so that you can write for an extension if necessary. Now, want to talk about what you can do then to monitor the environment of care on an ongoing basis. Specified areas that you need to investigate and monitor are going to include fire safety management, utilities management. So you're going to be able to use your CMMS tool to come alongside you in those areas and help out with that monitoring process. So for instance, you'd be able to use your CMMS tool to do things like track and document activities like fire drills. And I'm going to pull up a report there so that you would be able to go in and make sure that, for instance, you've done one per shift per quarter, that you have done them at varying times. That's something Sue talked about last year as a focus now. So making sure that we are doing those at different times and that you have that documentation and that those have been completed. Now, another way that your CMMS tool can help is being able to be a big advantage in the area of utilities management. We all know that we now have to have those inventories of utilities components, that we have to risk assess our equipment, and then we need to be able to report on our PM completion percentage on that equipment. And so your CMMS tool should be able to store your inventory, store that risk assessment on each item, and then allow you to report on those completion percentages. So I'm going to pull up an example of that report now, and that's going to give me the ability to look at a particular piece of equipment, to look at the work orders associated with that. Have they been completed? If not, we need to look into why not. To be able to look at its risk level, and then to be able to see the completion percentage for that piece of equipment, and then to also be able to see the completion percentage for that risk level overall. And these reports can be as well automated, sent again to engineering staff, environment of care committee, whoever will need that. And just to wrap up, to talk about more about that idea of keeping everyone informed, Sue discussed the importance of having information distributed to environment of care committee members in advance so that everyone is prepared. And your CMMS tool should be flexible enough to allow you to create the reports that you need in those areas, and then also to have those sent on automatically. So for instance, we've looked at some reports already that you can get with regards to your PM completion percentage on your equipment, to projects that you're doing, but also you should have the ability to modify, to customize your own reports. And so be able to create reports based on a specific location or a specific type of work that you're doing, or those categories that we talked about, that you have the ability to set up to break work down in a way that makes sense for you or makes sense for your tracking. So for instance, I should be able to choose those categories, and I should be able to set a time period for that. And I can set a specific time period here and get a report that's going to give me, that's going to be interactive, so that I can jump in and look at the specifics of those work orders, that I can look at, I can export this or print it, PDF, Excel, other formats, and that I can automate that and go ahead and have that sent to whomever needs that report. So I want to turn things back over to Sue at this point for those closing thoughts. If there are, and I appreciate your time this afternoon, if there are any of you who are using Maintenance Edge now, if you're current clients, you want to get some of those reminders, that documentation, reporting set up in your system, just let our client service team know, and they can get you set up with those. So at this point, I'm going to turn things back over to Sue for her closing thoughts and then for any questions that you may have for her. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks, Anna. So what I want to do is just really summarize what we've said today, and we've only given you, a few examples of how to look at these Joint Commission standards as a performance improvement opportunity. There are many others, and again, start out by keeping it in mind that the Joint Commission standards are really, really minimum level of compliance. Now, when you look at EC 040101, which is basically the data collection, it includes the environmental tours, it includes the annual evaluation and so forth, that's really a roadmap for improvement. It gives you some kind of generalized description of areas that you should be looking at, that you should be collecting data on. Then it takes you through the committee of how to manage that data, and then finally how to improve performance. So if you look at that all together as your guidance for how to navigate all of this, I think that's a good approach. Remember that when you go beyond the standards, that is going to improve your performance. If you just meet the standards, you're minimally compliant. And one of the goals of that Environment of Care Committee that you want to really put in place is improve patient safety. Because even though we are in the Environment of Care arena, we are not clinical. We need to think about everything that we do as impacting patient safety. And to improve our performance, to improve patient safety, is really where you want to be to contribute to a successful patient outcome and reduce the risk for the patient as well as others within the healthcare environment. So, remember, just as closing thoughts, and I thought this picture was so appropriate, minimum compliance is the Joint Commission standards. And does your organization want to be minimally compliant? When you look at the picture of the minimum viable product versus the product vision, I think you get a clear picture of what I talk about. You can be a very plain compliant organization, or you can really go above and beyond. And so that's what we're really suggesting that you do, is use the Joint Commission standards as a starting point and take off from there. And with that, we can turn it over for questions.
Thank you so much, Sue and Anna. That was just great information. And right now, I'll just ask that if you do have any questions, go ahead and submit those on the chat box on the left-hand side of your screen. At this point, we do have one question. Let's see. Sue, could you talk a little bit about the ideal involvement of a task force or an EOC committee in issues as they arise?
Well, first of all, in order to do that, you really need whatever system, whatever structure you're going to define to collect those issues. Where are you going to get it from? Are you going to get it from the publications? Are you going to get it from your environmental tours? Do you have a safety hotline or whatever? But if you put that system in place to collect this information on an ongoing basis, these issues can go under new business on the Environment Care Committee agenda. Then, with some discussion, the committee can decide if this is something that they need to handle within the committee itself, or because it's something that's going to involve some specialized knowledge, a task force needs to be appointed to look into this further and then report back to the committee with their conclusion. I think that getting the issues on the agenda is key, and then let the committee determine based on the issues who is best to handle that.
Okay, perfect. So another question, how would you have any best practices around how to make sure that the goals, that there's alignment around the goals and purpose and the actions that are taken by the committee? So how can you make sure that the actions taken by the committee are in alignment with the overall goals of the organization?
Well, one of the things, and we talked a little bit about this, is chartering your committee, which it's a really interesting process, and I recommend it a lot for struggling committees. What you can do is basically start, you want to get the committee in a place where they will all be present, they will not be distracted, and they will all be participating in this session. It's really kind of a retreat kind of activity where you start out by discussing what is the purpose of this committee. What are we supposed to be doing here? And, you go through a process of collecting feedback from everybody and ultimately arriving at a statement of mission or a statement of purpose for the committee. And then you look at your expectations of that committee. What is each member expected to do? And clearly, there are going to be some members who have to provide specific reports at certain times and things like that. But in general, are they supposed to be present at X percentage of the meeting? Are you going to start your meetings on time and end your meetings on time? What are you expected to bring to that meeting? What are you expected to do following that meeting? What are you expected to do in terms of listening to the people who are talking and contributing as appropriate, to having everything on the table in the meeting and not discussing them in the corridor afterwards? That sort of thing. Really put your guidelines and expectations together for these committee members based on a committee-defined mission or purpose statement. And I think that's one of the best ways.
That's great. I like that. Put it in writing so that everybody knows.
Mm-hmm.
What would you suggest the best ways to communicate to folks who are not on the committee, the purpose of the committee, and kind of how they can also, be a part of its goals?
Well, I think if you go through this chartering process, one of the things that you want to do is, basically publish that charter. And your committee is supposed to have leadership, hospital leadership on the committee. So that would be one thing that administrative representative could take back to hospital leadership, and together there might be some determination made of how they want that distributed throughout the organization.
Perfect. Well, that covers all the questions that we have today, Sue. Really appreciate your time today, and just wanted to put this out there for folks that joined us today. If you would like more information on Sue's organization and MSL Healthcare Partners, or on Facility Dude CMMS software, we invite you to request more information here. We appreciate you attending today. We will be sending out a recording of this webinar. Hope that you've enjoyed the information shared here today, and look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Sue.